Ever feel like the world's getting a bit tense?
Mm-hmm.
Like there's this low hum of global anxiety that just keeps getting louder?
Yeah.
Well, today's deep dive, it isn't exactly gonna, soothe your worries,
Right.
but it will, I think, equip you to understand some of the forces at play.
Absolutely.
We're tackling America's Cold War Against China, 2024 by Peter Nolan.
Okay.
And trust me, this book, it's a wild ride.
It's a fascinating read.
This book, it doesn't mess around.
Uh,
Nolan comes right out and calls this clash a new Cold War.
yeah.
Fundamentally different, he says, from the standoff with the Soviet Union.
Right.
And get this, he links this struggle to your daily life
Interesting.
in ways you might not expect. Like the phone in your pocket.
Okay.
Those climate doom scrolling sessions,
Oh.
even what pops up on your social media feeds.
I see.
So to help us unpack all of this, I've got our expert on the line. Let's dive in, shall we?
Let's do it. What I find so fascinating about that book is that it really pushes past the headlines
Okay.
and reveals just how deeply intertwined these two global powers are, and how those historical threads have led to where we are today.
Okay, so rewind with me for a second. Most of us, we grew up with the Cold War as a given, right?
Right.
Like the U.S. and the USSR destined to be at odds.
Yeah.
But Nolan says, not so fast. It wasn't inevitable.
That's true.
And to grasp why this new Cold War is different, we have to understand how each side views the world.
Exactly. Nolan contrasts the West's historical, as he puts it, hegemony drive, which is, I guess, a fancy way of saying wanting to be top dog, and shaping the world in its image with China's more pragmatic approach. And that's rooted in millennia of history.
Well, define pragmatic for me here. Does that just
Sure.
mean they're practical?
It's more than that. Think about Confucianism.
Yuck.
A core philosophy in China for centuries. It emphasizes harmony, balance, finding solutions that benefit everyone.
Mhm.
And for over 1,000 years, we're talking long before Europe really kind of got its act together, China had this meritocratic bureaucracy.
Okay.
Officials were chosen based on their skills and ability, and their whole focus was solving real-world problems for their people,
Interesting.
not expanding empires or forcing their ideology on others.
Okay, so it's less about imposing their will and more about, what, maintaining stability,
Yeah,
keeping things running smoothly.
exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay. Nolan gives this example of the Opium Wars in the 19th century.
Right.
Western powers, wanting to force China open to trade, literally went to war to sell opium to the Chinese people.
Wow.
And this wasn't about some grand vision of spreading democracy. It was about profit, even at the expense of another nation's well-being. This clash of worldviews.
Right.
The West's hegemony drive versus China's focus on stability, on practical solutions. It echoes through history, and it sets the stage for the tensions we see today.
So we're not just talking about two countries disagreeing. We're talking about two fundamentally different ways of approaching, I don't know,
Power, global interactions, the whole shebang.
I think that's a great way to put it.
And those differences, they're about to erupt in some pretty significant ways.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork.
Yeah.
We've explored some of that historical baggage that's fueling this new Cold War.
Yeah.
But where does it actually play out?
Right.
Like, where are the battle lines being drawn?
Oh,
Well, Nolan identifies 5 key fronts, and this is where things get really wild.
it's true.
Because these aren't just like distant conflicts, they impact all of us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, get ready for a world tour of geopolitical hotspots.
I love it.
Okay.
Let's do it.
First up, we've got Xinjiang.
Okay.
Now, you've probably heard about this region in the news.
Right.
Human rights concerns, allegations of oppression against the Uyghur population.
For sure.
But Nolan, he pushes us to look deeper.
And he does that well. What's interesting about Xinjiang, aside from, the cultural significance of it, is that it's strategically really important.
Okay.
It connects China to Central Asia,
Right.
and it's rich in natural resources.
Okay.
And while there are legitimate concerns about some of China's policies there, Nolan's quick to point out that the U.S. has been actively funding Uyghur separatist groups,
Interesting.
many of which have ties to, the war on terror narrative.
It's that old saying, right?
Yeah.
One man's terrorist.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how much of the West's outrage here is about genuine concern versus, well, I don't know, using the Uyghur situation as leverage against China.
It's a good question. It's hard to say for sure.
Right.
And then you've got the South China Sea,
Oh, boy, yeah.
a literal powder keg.
Yeah.
We're talking overlapping territorial claims, vital shipping lanes, and a whole lot of posturing.
Okay, I want you to imagine this for a second, okay?
Okay.
You've got a tiny island that you own, thousands of miles away, right?
Okay.
Now imagine drawing a line around that island and claiming control over a massive area of ocean
Right.
and all the resources within it.
Okay.
Sounds a bit bold, right?
It does.
Well, that, in a nutshell, is the concept of an exclusive economic zone,
There you go.
or EEZ.
Easy.
Right, and the book calls out what it calls Western hypocrisy on this issue.
Yeah.
Many Western powers, including the U.S., have these massive EZs.
They do. A lot of them were established during their colonial past,
Right.
you know. But as soon as China starts asserting its claims in the South China Sea, suddenly it's a threat to international order.
It's like Nolan is saying, like, hey, let's not forget how we got here.
Right.
History matters, people.
Yeah.
Okay. Next on our geopolitical world tour, Hong Kong.
Okay.
Now, this one hits close to home for many of us. Remember those massive pro-democracy protests a few years back?
I do, yeah.
Hong Kong has a unique history. It was a British colony until 1997, when it was returned to China under this one country, two systems framework.
Right.
And this agreement, known as the Basic Law, was supposed to guarantee Hong Kong a high degree of autonomy for 50 years.
Right.
But Nolan argues that the West, particularly the U.S., saw Hong Kong through a very specific lens
Interesting.
as this potential catalyst for democratic change in mainland China.
Okay.
And when those protests erupted, they were framed almost exclusively as a fight for democracy against authoritarianism.
Yeah. And what often gets overlooked is that from China's perspective, those protests, those were a direct challenge to its sovereignty,
Wow.
a threat to their national unity.
Okay.
The Basic Law, from their perspective, was being undermined by foreign influence.
So two very different interpretations of the same events.
Right.
It really highlights how important, I don't know, context and perspective are in understanding this new Cold War.
It's true.
And speaking of high stakes,
Yeah.
Nolan calls Taiwan the, quote, most dangerous flashpoint of them all.
It's a scary thought.
It is a scary thought.
Yeah.
And in 2022, even NATO's Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, labeled China a strategic threat,
Yeah.
specifically citing Taiwan.
Yeah.
And the reason this tiny island is so important,
Okay.
well, to understand that, we need to talk about our fifth front, the semiconductor war. Ah, yes, the semiconductor war.
Uh-huh.
This one's a doozy,
Hmm.
because it's not just about armies and missiles.
Right.
It's about something far more fundamental to our modern lives.
Okay.
The tiny chips that power, well, practically everything. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
From like ancient Chinese history to 21st century microchips.
It's a lot.
And it's easy to get lost in the weeds, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's all very interesting, but like, I'm not a diplomat. I'm not a CEO. So how does this new Cold War actually affect me?
And that's precisely the point Nolan drives home, right? This
Yeah.
isn't just some, like, abstract geopolitical chess match.
Right.
This is playing out in our economies, our news feeds,
Oh,
even
yeah.
our psychology.
Yeah, the book really dives deep into this idea of economic anxiety.
Yeah.
You know, that feeling so many people in the West have, that the future is uncertain,
Right.
that things aren't what they used to be.
Yeah.
And Nolan links that, in part, to China's rise.
He does. He even brings up Oswald Spengler,
Okay.
who wrote about the decline of the West back in the early 1900s.
Right.
Now Nolan's not saying that China is single-handedly responsible for the West's problems, but
Right.
he argues that the loss of manufacturing jobs, the rise of inequality, even the sense that the West's global dominance is fading,
Right.
China's growth plays a role in all of that.
And here's where it gets really mind-bending, okay? Nolan argues this new Cold War, it's even shaping how we think
Wow.
and how we interact online.
I see where you're going with this.
Remember how we talked about social media earlier?
Right.
It's not just about cat videos anymore. If it ever was.
Right.
Think about it. The algorithms that drive these platforms,
Yeah.
they're designed to keep us scrolling.
We are engaged.
And what keeps us scrolling?
Exactly.
Often, it's outrage.
Yeah.
It's fear. It's the sense that, like, the other side is a threat.
Right.
It's like that whole military-industrial complex thing, you know, that Eisenhower warned about.
Right.
But for the digital age, we're so primed for conflict,
We are.
so bombarded with information and misinformation.
Yeah.
That it's harder than ever to just like step back and see the bigger picture.
Absolutely.
And this climate of fear and distrust, it only makes it easier for those in power to escalate this new Cold War,
Right.
even if it's not in anyone's best interest long term.
Which is why Nolan's message is ultimately one of, dare I say it, cautious optimism.
Okay.
He argues that the only way forward for both the U.S. and China is through cooperation, not conflict.
Okay, tell me more about that, because right now cooperation feels like a pretty tall order.
It does, but Nolan argues that the challenges facing humanity in the 21st century, things like climate change, pandemics, artificial intelligence, these are global issues that require global solutions.
Right.
No one nation can tackle them alone.
Right.
And the truth is, the U.S. and China need each other if we're going to create a future where everyone can thrive.
So what's the takeaway for our listener then? What should they be doing with all this information swirling around?
I think the key is to be aware of the forces at play, to understand the historical baggage, the economic anxieties, the ways in which this new Cold War is being waged on multiple fronts, both physical and digital, because the more aware we are, the less likely we are to be swept up in the fear and the hype.
And maybe, just maybe, if enough of us start demanding a different approach, one based on, I don't know, cooperation, understanding, a shared vision for the future,
Right.
well, maybe we can avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. That's a lot to ponder. And something tells me this conversation isn't over just yet. But for now, we'll leave you with this. Nolan ends his book by saying that the U.S. has historically needed an external enemy to maintain its sense of unity and purpose.
Okay.
With the Soviet Union gone, is China now filling that void? And if so, at what cost? Something for you to think about.